2:15 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The aircraft carrier USS John C, Stennis, was already heeling hard to starboard. This was not a routine intercept. Radar operators were counting 180 incoming signatures. Usually, a swarm consisted of 10 or 20 units. Today, the math of survival had changed. The morning had been calm. Now, the ocean was a blur of white water as the 100,000-ton vessel accelerated. The giant propellers churned the deep blue water into a violent wake. The deck was tilted at an extreme angle. This was a defensive maneuver designed to make the ship a harder target. It was also a sign of desperation. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was cold and filled with the hum of electronic cooling fans. Glowing blue screens showed a massive cloud of red icons. They were approaching from the north, the east, and the south simultaneously. It looked like a digital storm on the tactical display. The icons were blinking rapidly. This indicated a high rate of closure. The tactical action officer spoke to the captain. "Sir, we have multiple launch points, 180 contacts and climbing." Captain Miller looked at the display. His face was illuminated by the flickering light of the radar. "Confirm classification." The officer responded. "High speed, low altitude. These are suicide drones. They are moving at 300 knots. They are coming in 3 distinct waves." The captain performed a quick calculation in his head. The math did not work. The ship had 3 close-in weapon systems. Each system could theoretically engage 60 targets per minute if every shot was a hit. But the drones were zigzagging. The swarm would reach the carrier in less than 3 minutes. If the drones hit the flight deck, the fuel and munitions stored there would turn the ship into a furnace. 1,000 miles away, in a hardened command center in Zhanjiang, a Chinese commander watched the same cloud of red icons. He did not look for a kill. He looked for a specific reaction. He wanted to see how the American Aegis system handled a saturation attack that exceeded its processing limit. The commander spoke to his technician. "Launch the final 60 units. We must verify the American response threshold under maximum pressure." The technician pressed a single key. "Launching now." The swarm is responding to the updated vector. Back on the Stennis, the alarm for general quarters began to scream. It was a mechanical, rhythmic sound that vibrated through the heavy steel deck. Thousands of sailors were running to their stations. Metal hatches were slammed shut and locked. The ship was sealing itself for impact. The sky was still blue. The horizon was still empty to the naked eye. But the radar told a different story. The electronic eyes of the carrier saw a wall of metal approaching at incredible speed. The air was thick with electronic signals. Both sides were trying to jam each other. The drones were using mesh networking to bypass the American interference. Captain Miller keyed his radio. "Escort ships. This is Stennis. Engage at will. Protect the deck at all costs." The commander of the destroyer, USS Chung-Hoon, responded immediately. "Copy, Stennis. We are tracking. Engaging with 5-inch guns and airburst rounds now." The first explosions of black smoke appeared in the distant sky. These were the ranging shots. The drones were still invisible to the eye. They were small. They were fast. And there were simply too many of them. The math was cold. The math was certain. The pilot of a nearby F-35 watched the horizon from 30,000 feet. He saw the black puffs of smoke. He saw the carrier leaning into its turn. He knew that if a single drone reached that flight deck, the mission was over. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:21 in the afternoon. The Combat Information Center. The air inside the Combat Information Center felt heavy. It was the weight of 180 incoming threats. Every console was manned. Every face was pale under the blue tactical lights. The senior chief petty officer called out the data as it refreshed on the main screen. "Captain, identification is confirmed. We are looking at a modified version of the Blowfish 3 unmanned helicopter. They are carrying shaped charge warheads. They are designed for top-down attacks on flight decks and sensitive radar arrays." The officer responded. 32 nautical miles. Closing at 80 meters per second. The captain turned to the communications officer. "Transmit on the guard frequency." Identify us. Demand they change course. Use the standard hailing protocol. The communications officer keyed the wide area broadcast. Unidentified drone swarm. This is the United States ship John C. Stennis. You are on a collision course with a United States carrier strike group. You are standing into danger. Alter your course immediately to the north, or we will be forced to defend ourselves. Silence followed the transmission. The only sound in the room was the clicking of keyboards and the low whine of the ship's massive engines. There was no reply from the drones. There was no reply from any mothership. The swarm moved as a single organism. It was cold. It was silent. It was programmed. 2:23 in the afternoon, 5 miles to the west of the carrier. The destroyer USS Chung-Hoon was cutting through the swells at 30 knots. Thick smoke poured from its stacks as it moved into a screening position between the carrier and the northern swarm. Behind it, the USS Decatur adjusted its bearing to cover the southern approach. The destroyers were the outer shield of the strike group. The commander of the Chung-Hoon stood on the bridge. He watched the horizon through high-powered binoculars. The sea appeared empty. The sun reflected off the waves in bright flashes. But his digital display was screaming. He spoke to his weapons officer. The Aegis system is tracking 80 targets in our sector. Can we engage all of them simultaneously? The weapons officer checked his screen. Negative, sir. The system can track them, but we do not have enough interceptors for a 1-to-1 ratio. If we fire our missiles now, we will be empty in 60 seconds. We must rely on the 5-inch gun and the electronic warfare suite. The commander nodded. Priority is the carrier. If they get past us, the Stennis is open. Prepare the 5-inch gun for rapid fire. 2:25 in the afternoon, the Philippine Sea. The swarm reached the 30-mile line. This was the point of no return for the rules of engagement. In any other scenario, a single aircraft crossing this line would be met with a warning shot or a radio challenge. But 180 drones did not leave room for warnings. Suddenly, the swarm shifted. It was not a random movement. The 3 distinct groups began to spiral. They were creating a vortex pattern. This was a sophisticated tactic designed to confuse the radar logic of the Aegis system. By constantly changing altitude and bearing in a coordinated dance, they made it impossible for the ship computers to predict an exact flight path. The tactical action officer on the Stennis shouted, "Sir, they are maneuvering. They are executing a saturation spiral. We are losing solid locks. The radar is struggling to distinguish individual targets." The captain gripped the edge of the metal chart table. "Go to automated engagement. Release the weapons. Now." Across the strike group, the sounds of war began. The deep, rhythmic thud of the 5-inch guns started. Each shell was programmed to explode in a cloud of tungsten pellets. The sky was about to become a wall of lead. But the drones did not flinch. They accelerated. 2:26 in the afternoon, the Philippine Sea. The swarm was no longer a chaotic cloud. It had transformed into a geometry of 3 distinct blades. One group of 60 drones dropped until they were only 10 feet above the crests of the waves. They disappeared into the radar clutter of the Whitecaps. The second group climbed steeply to 15,000 feet. They were positioning for a high-angle dive. The third group remained at center mass. They were the distraction. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar screens were flickering. The Aegis system was designed to track hundreds of targets, but these targets were not behaving like missiles. They were communicating with each other. When one drone was targeted by a ship's radar, the entire group shifted its position to shield the leader. The tactical action officer spoke loudly over the noise of the cooling fans. "Captain, the northern group has dropped below the radar horizon. We have lost track of 60 units. The southern group is accelerating to 400 knots. They are splitting our focus." Captain Miller stood at the center of the room. He looked at the empty space on the screen where 60 drones had just been. They are masking their approach in the sea state. Shift the SPY radar to high sensitivity mode. I want those wave huggers back on the screen. 2:27 in the afternoon, Zhangjiang, China. The command center was silent. The only sound was the soft chime of data packets being received from the swarm. The Chinese commander stood with his hands behind his back. He watched a three-dimensional projection of the American strike group. The red dots of his drones were closing in like a tightening noose. The technician reported the status. The American destroyers are radiating at maximum power. They are trying to burn through our jamming. The Aegis logic is currently operating at 92% capacity. We are approaching the saturation threshold. The commander nodded slowly. They are professional. They are waiting for the final mile to commit their main batteries. Switch the swarm to the Wolfpack protocol. Let the drones decide their own terminal vectors. No more manual control. Confirm, the technician said. The swarm is now autonomous. 2:29 in the afternoon. The bridge of the USS John C, Stennis. The admiral had arrived from his ready room. He stood next to Captain Miller. Both men watched the horizon through the thick glass of the bridge. The sky was still empty, but the air felt charged with static. The admiral spoke. His voice was low. What is the official rules of engagement status? Captain Miller replied immediately. They have crossed the 30-mile mark. They are maneuvering aggressively. They have ignored all hailing frequencies. By definition, this has demonstrated hostile intent. If they cross 20 miles, it becomes a hostile act. The admiral looked at the clock. That gives us 60 seconds to decide if we are starting a war. If we fire, we cannot take those missiles back. If we do not fire, we might lose this ship. The tactical action officer's voice came over the internal circuit. Sir, the wave huggers have reappeared. They are at 12 miles. They are inside the inner defense layer. The first group of drones had emerged from the spray of the ocean. They were no longer icons on a screen. They were physical objects. Small, gray, relentless. Captain Miller looked at the admiral. The admiral nodded once. All ships, Captain Miller commanded. This is Stennis. Engagement is authorized. Clear the skies. The 5-inch guns on the destroyers shifted from ranging shots to rapid fire. A wall of fire and steel began to erupt around the carrier. The water was being whipped into a frenzy by falling shrapnel. The drones did not slow down. They began to jink. They were dancing through the explosions. 2:31 in the afternoon. The Pentagon. Inside the National Military Command Center, the atmosphere was frozen. A wall of high-definition monitors displayed a live data feed from the Philippine Sea. The video showed the USS John C. Stennis listing heavily as it turned at high speed. Small puffs of black smoke from the escort destroyers dotted the horizon. A senior analyst leaned toward a general. His voice was a whisper. Sir, we are looking at the math of death. The Stennis has 3 close-in weapon systems. These are the 20mm Gatling guns designed for final defense. Each mount carries 1,500 rounds. At a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, each gun has exactly 20 seconds of continuous fire. If they do not hit every drone in the first burst, the ship will be defenseless in less than a minute. The general did not look away from the screen. And the escort ships. The analyst shook his head. The destroyers are being saturated. The swarm is splitting. 60 drones are focused on the Chung-Hoon to keep her busy. The remaining 120 are moving for the carrier. The density of the attack is higher than any simulation we have ever run. 2:33 in the afternoon. The Combat Information Center. The noise of the 5-inch guns on the escort ships was now audible through the hull of the carrier. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency thud that vibrated in the chests of the crew. On the tactical screens, the red icons were now merging into a single solid mass. The distance was 8 miles. The tactical action officer spoke with urgency. Captain, the drones are using our own radar against us. They are homing in on the SP-1 signals. Every time we pulse the radar to get a lock, we are providing them a digital map to our bridge. Captain Miller looked at the admiral. The admiral was a veteran of the Cold War. He knew that sometimes the best defense was to disappear. The admiral spoke. Captain, we are going dark. Set emission control alpha. Secure all active sensors. Shut down the radar. Shut down the radios. Shut down every electronic device that is radiating into the atmosphere. Captain Miller hesitated for only a second. Sir. If we go dark, the close-in weapon systems will lose their primary targeting data. The Admiral's voice was flat. They are already hitting us. We are currently a giant lighthouse in a dark ocean. Turn off the lights. 2:35 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. Across the carrier, the electronic heartbeat of the ship stopped. The massive radar arrays stopped spinning. The high-powered jamming pods went silent. To the drones, the giant electronic target they had been chasing suddenly vanished. Inside the Chinese command center in Zhangjiang, the technician gasped. The American carrier has gone to total emission control. We have lost the primary homing signal. The Chinese commander leaned forward. They are blind, but they are also hidden. Switch the drones to optical recognition. Tell the swarm to look for the wake of the ship. The white water does not go dark. The drones adjusted. Small cameras in their noses began to scan the blue water. They looked for the long, white scar of the carrier's wake. On the deck of the Stennis, the sailors at the machine gun mounts looked into the distance. The sky was no longer empty. A dark, buzzing cloud was visible on the horizon. It looked like a storm of insects. The silence of the ship was terrifying. There were no more alarms, only the sound of the wind and the rushing water. Captain Miller stood on the bridge wing. He pulled his goggles down over his eyes. Here they come. 2:36 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The silence of the ship was absolute. To the naked eye, the horizon was no longer empty. A dark, vibrating line had appeared just above the waves. It was the northern wave of the swarm. 180 drones were now visible. They looked like a smudge of charcoal against the blue sky. Then, the smudge began to fragment into individual points of gray. Inside the Combat Information Center, the sailors sat in near darkness. Without radar, they were listening to the ship. They felt the vibrations of the deck. They felt the carrier leaning into its high-speed turn. They were waiting for the first impact. The air conditioning hummed, but it could not mask the sound of heavy breathing. Captain Miller spoke over the internal circuit. His voice was measured and low. Gunnery teams. Optical tracking only. Wait for the 1-mile mark. Do not waste the ammunition. We only get one chance at this. 2:38 in the afternoon. On the destroyer USS Chung-Hoon, the 5-inch gun was screaming. It was firing one shell every 2 seconds. High in the air, the programmable shells exploded. They created a curtain of steel pellets. The drones flew directly into the wall of lead. One drone clipped a fragment. Its rotor shattered instantly. It tumbled into the ocean and disappeared in a small splash of white foam. Then another drone fell, and another. But for every drone that fell, 3 more adjusted their flight path. They were not human. They did not feel fear. They were learning the pattern of the flak in real time. The swarm began to spread out further. They were no longer a tight group. They were a net of explosives that was closing around the carrier. 2:39 in the afternoon. Zhangjiang, China. The Chinese technician watched the optical feed from a lead drone. The image was grainy and shaken by the wind. It showed the massive gray shape of the American carrier. The wake was a bright white line stretching for miles behind it. The carrier was moving fast, but the technician knew it could not outrun the math. The technician reported to his commander, "Lead units are at 4,000 meters. The American destroyers have destroyed 12% of the first wave. The saturation level remains well above the defensive threshold. Impact is estimated in 120 seconds." The Chinese commander did not smile. He watched the screen with a look of intense focus. Watch the carrier carefully. They are professional. They would not go dark unless they had a secondary plan. Look for any electronic spikes. 2:40 in the afternoon. The deck of the USS John C. Stennis. The sun was hot on the steel. The wind whipped across the empty flight deck. The sailors at the machine gun mounts gripped their triggers. Their knuckles were white. The buzzing sound was no longer a distant hum. It was a roar. It sounded like a million angry bees. The first drone crossed the 2-mile line. It was flying low. It was flying fast. Captain Miller watched from the bridge wing. He saw a flash of silver in the sky. It was the sunlight hitting the carbon fiber of a drone. It was followed by dozens more. They were coming from 3 directions at once. The northern group was low, the southern group was high. The center group was accelerating. He checked his watch. Prepare for kinetic engagement. Mark. The carrier was no longer just a ship. It was a target. And the target was about to bite back. The entire hull of the ship seemed to hold its breath. 2:41 in the afternoon, the Philippine Sea. The drone swarm reached the 5-mile mark. The sky was no longer blue. It was a mosaic of gray shapes moving at 300 knots. The sound was a physical weight. It was a high-pitched, mechanical scream that drowned out the roar of the wind. On the bridge, Captain Miller watched the optical feed on the main monitor. The drones were coming in a staggered formation. They were not flying in a straight line. They were weaving in a pre-programmed avoidance pattern. This made it nearly impossible for the manual machine gunners to lead their targets. The tactical action officer shouted over the noise. Range 4 miles. Weapons free on all mounts. Automatic engagement initiated. The first close-in weapon system on the starboard side activated. The Mark 15 Phalanx system, a 20mm Gatling gun, began to spin its 6 barrels. Then, it fired. The sound was not like a normal gun. It was a continuous, bone-shaking buzz. It sounded like a giant industrial saw cutting through a sheet of heavy metal. A stream of tracer rounds reached out into the sky. They looked like a solid, glowing beam of red light. The lead drone in the northern group was hit. It did not just fall. It disintegrated. A cloud of carbon fiber and microelectronics vanished in a flash of orange fire. The gun immediately shifted its aim. 2 seconds later, another drone was gone. Then a third. 2:41 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. The carrier was now surrounded by a wall of tracers. All 3 close-in weapon systems were firing at their maximum rate. The air on the flight deck was filled with the acrid smell of burnt cordite and ozone. Spent brass casings were pouring out of the gun mounts in a steady stream. They hit the non-skid deck in a golden rain. Inside the Combat Information Center, the digital ammunition counters were spinning backward. The numbers were yellow, then orange, then red. Starboard mount at 60%, a sailor called out. Aft mount at 55%. Port mount is engaging the low-altitude wave, 40%, and falling. The drones were dying, but they were dying according to a cold, mathematical plan. For every drone the guns destroyed, the remaining units adjusted their flight paths to fill the gaps. The swarm was narrowing its focus. They were no longer attacking the ship as a whole. They were all aiming for a single point. They were targeting the base of the island where the primary sensors and command staff were located. 2:42 in the afternoon. The distance was 1 mile. This was the terminal phase of the engagement. At 300 knots, the drones covered a mile in less than 12 seconds. The guns were firing without interruption. From the intense heat of the friction, Captain Miller stood on the bridge wing. He could see the individual rotors on the drones now. He could see the small optical cameras in their noses. They looked like dead, black eyes. A drone on the port side took a direct hit to its wing. It spiraled wildly out of control. It missed the edge of the flight deck by 10 feet and slammed into the ocean. The explosion sent a massive plume of salt water into the air that drenched the sailors at the nearby gun mounts. The Admiral watched the tactical display. They are going to breach the perimeter. We do not have enough lead in the air to stop them all. The starboard guns suddenly stopped. A red warning light flashed on the gunner's console. Starboard mount is empty, out of ammunition. Seconds later, the aft mount followed. Aft mount empty. Reloading protocol is inhibited by target proximity. Only one gun remained active. It was firing at a group of 30 drones. They were 300 meters away. The sound was deafening. The vibrations were shaking the heavy glass in the bridge windows. The lead drone was 50 meters from the hull. Its nose pitched down into a final attack dive. It was aiming directly for the flight deck, just feet away from a parked F-18. Captain Miller braced his boots against the deck. He gripped the metal rail of the bridge wing until his knuckles turned white. He watched the gray shape grow larger. He waited for the sound of tearing metal. He waited for the wall of fire. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath. 2:43 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The lead drone was a gray blur. It was moving at 300 knots. It was 50 meters from the steel hull of the island. On the bridge wing, Captain Miller instinctively raised his arm to shield his face. He felt the heat of the air. He smelled the ozone from the guns. He waited for the end. Then, the drone did not strike. At the final millisecond, its nose pitched up violently. The drone climbed at a 90-degree angle. It missed the top of the carrier's primary radar mast by less than 3 feet. The wind from its passage rattled the glass in the bridge windows. Captain Miller opened his eyes. He looked up. The sky was filled with 100 drones. They were no longer diving. They were no longer weaving. They had all performed the same synchronized maneuver. They were now climbing in a perfect, vertical column. Inside the Combat Information Center, the Tactical Action Officer stared at his screen. The red icons were moving away from the ship. Captain, they are breaking off. All remaining units are climbing to 5,000 feet. The Admiral grabbed the edge of the console. Did we hit them with a jammer? Did the electronic warfare suite finally kick in? The electronic warfare officer shook his head. His face was pale. Negative, sir. Our systems are still dark. We are not radiating. They are moving on their own. It looks like a command override. 2:43 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. Zhangjiang, China. The command center was in chaos. The technician was standing up. He was slamming his hands onto the keyboard. The three-dimensional projection of the swarm was flashing yellow. Commander, we have lost uplink, the technician shouted. The autonomous logic has been suppressed. Something is broadcasting a high-level override signal on our primary command frequency. The Chinese commander moved to the screen. Is it the Americans? Are they jamming the satellite link? The technician looked at his diagnostic data. No, sir. This is not jamming. This is a digital handshake. The drones have received a valid termination code. But that code is encrypted. Only 3 people in our high command have that key, and none of them are in this room. The commander looked at the screen in silence. Then who just stopped the attack? 2:44 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The drones reached 5,000 feet. They stopped their climb simultaneously. They began to spread out. They formed a massive, perfect circle. The circle was 3 miles in diameter. The USS John C, Stennis, was at the exact center of the ring. 100 drones sat in the sky. They were hovering. Their rotors created a low, constant thrum that could be felt through the deck of the ship. They were not attacking. They were not leaving. They were watching. Captain Miller walked back onto the bridge. He looked at the Admiral. They are holding us in place. It is a blockade in the sky. The Admiral looked at the ring of drones. He looked at the empty gun mounts on his ship. The barrels were still smoking. The deck was covered in thousands of spent casings. They had survived the swarm. But they were now trapped in a cage made of the very weapons that had almost destroyed them. We are not in a war, the Admiral said quietly. We are in a demonstration. The silence on the ship was heavier than the noise of the guns. Every sailor on the deck looked up at the sky. They saw the gray shapes. They saw the black cameras. They realized that the world they knew had ended 30 seconds ago. The math had been solved by someone else. 2:44 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The USS John C. Stennis sat at the center of a geometric nightmare. 100 drones remained in the sky, spaced at perfect 30-meter intervals. They formed a ring that stretched 3 miles in diameter. To the sailors on the flight deck, it looked like a crown of thorns made of carbon fiber and steel. The buzzing sound had settled into a low, vibrating hum that resonated through the ship's hull. Inside the Combat Information Center, the silence was heavy. The tactical displays showed the red icons as a static circle. They were not moving. They were not radiating. They were simply there. Captain Miller looked at the Admiral. We are sitting ducks, sir. If they decide to resume the attack, our guns are empty. We have teams on the deck trying to reload the close-in weapon systems, but it will take 10 minutes to reset the feeds and cycle the ammunition. The admiral did not look at the captain. He was staring at a secondary monitor showing the feed from a long-range optical sensor. They are not going to attack, Captain. If they wanted to kill us, we would already be burning. This is a message. They are showing us that they have total control over the engagement window. Control is an understatement, the tactical action officer added. Sir, we have analyzed the override signal. It did not come from our ships. It was a satellite burst from the mainland. They essentially pulled the leash on their own dogs at the very last second. They wanted us to see the teeth before they pulled back. 2:47 in the afternoon. Washington, District of Columbia. In a secure room beneath the State Department, the Secretary of State sat across from a red telephone. It was not a literal red phone, but a high-encryption digital terminal. It began to chime. The secretary picked up the receiver. "This is Washington," he said. A voice responded from Beijing. The translation was nearly instantaneous. "The demonstration in the Philippine Sea has concluded. Our swarm has verified the saturation limits of the Aegis logic. We have also demonstrated that our command and control can be terminated with surgical precision. We have no desire for a kinetic conflict today." The secretary tightened his grip on the phone. "You nearly destroyed a carrier strike group. You crossed every line of international law and military protocol. This was not a demonstration. This was an act of war. It was a test of the math," the voice from Beijing replied calmly. "Your carriers rely on the assumption that your defenses can handle the volume of modern threats. Today, the math proved otherwise. We have shown you that your primary strategic asset can be neutralized without a single shot being fired. We suggest you reconsider your current patrol route." The line went dead. The secretary looked at the general standing next to him. "They are calling it a mathematical proof. They just held a knife to our throat and then put it back in their pocket to show us how fast they can move." 2:50 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. On the bridge of the Stennis, the internal comms crackled. "Bridge. This is combat. We are detecting a new signal. The drones are rotating their rotors. They are changing pitch." Captain Miller stepped back onto the bridge wing. The 100 drones began to tilt their noses toward the west. In perfect unison, the ring broke. The drones did not fly away in a group. They scattered in 100 different directions, like a firework expanding outward. Within 30 seconds, they were small dots on the horizon. Within 60 seconds, the sky was empty and blue once again. The admiral let out a long breath. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his heart was racing. "Stand down from general quarters. Set condition 3 across the strike group. Get the damage control teams to inspect the hull for any near-miss structural issues. And someone get me a direct line to 7th Fleet. We have a lot to talk about." The carrier began to slow its turn. The massive wake straightened out into a long, white line. The ocean was quiet, but the feeling of safety had vanished. The crew knew that the drones had not left because they were defeated. They had left because they were finished. The immediate crisis was over. The long-term reality was just beginning. 2:51 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The sky was a deep and empty blue. It was as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. The sun continued to beat down on the Pacific, turning the water into a sheet of polished glass. But on the flight deck of the USS John C. Stennis, the evidence of the struggle was everywhere. Thousands of spent 20mm brass casings covered the non-skid surface. They shifted and clattered with every movement of the ship. The 3 close-in weapon systems were silent now. Their barrels were still smoking, radiating a distorted heat that blurred the air around them. Technicians wearing heavy, heat-resistant gloves began the delicate process of clearing jammed feeds and inspecting the rifling. There was no cheering. There was no sense of victory. The sailors moved with a mechanical, somber efficiency. They had seen how close the gray shapes had come. They had felt the wind of the drones passing their faces. Inside the Combat Information Center, the Admiral watched the last red icons fade from the edge of the long-range display. The icons were blinking out one by one as the drones dropped below the radar horizon, heading toward their recovery points or a mothership, hidden over the curve of the Earth. The tactical action officer spoke without looking up from his console. The swarm has cleared the 200-mile mark, sir. They are no longer a factor in this theater. The airspace is clear. The Admiral turned to Captain Miller. His voice was tired and hollow. They showed us the wall, Captain. They showed us exactly where our defenses stopped working. We did not win this engagement. We were spared. Captain Miller nodded slowly. He looked at the empty ammunition counts on the secondary screen. If they had sent 50 more, we would be fighting fires in the hangar bay right now. The math is undeniable. 2:54 in the afternoon. Zhanjiang, China. In the command center, the atmosphere was one of clinical efficiency. The tension had evaporated, replaced by the quiet hum of data processing. The Chinese commander watched as his teams began to download the massive telemetry files from the swarm's onboard sensors. The technician reported the status in a flat, professional tone. "We have the full data set, Commander. We have the American radar response patterns. We have their automated fire sequences. Most importantly, we have the thermal limits and ammunition exhaustion rates of their final defense layer. The predictive model is now 100% complete." The commander looked at the three-dimensional replay of the final terminal dive. He saw his lead drone pull up inches from the American bridge. "Seal the data. Send the encrypted files to the Academy of Military Sciences immediately." This is the new baseline for maritime denial. Three o'clock in the afternoon, the Philippine Sea. The USS John C. Stennis had returned to a straight and steady course. The heavy list to starboard was gone. The giant ship moved through the water at a relaxed 20 knots. The flight deck crews, dressed in their colored jerseys, began to move the F-18 Hornets back into their designated launch positions. The routine of the carrier strike group was resuming, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The pilots sitting in their cockpits did not look at the horizon with the same confidence they had 3 hours ago. They checked their instruments. They tested their electronic warfare pods. They knew that the next time the sky turned gray, the termination code might not be sent. Captain Miller stood at the window of the bridge. He watched a lone seagull dive for a fish in the wake of the ship. He realized that the era of the carrier had not ended with a bang or a fire. It had ended with a silent, digital handshake in the middle of a clear blue afternoon. The ocean was quiet. But every man and woman on the ship knew the truth. The world had become much smaller. And they were no longer the only ones who knew how to hunt in it. 3 days later, 9:15 in the morning, the Pentagon. The conference room was windowless and smelled of stale coffee. On the massive digital screen, a single graph was displayed. It was a simple line. The line tracked the relationship between incoming targets and defensive interceptor capacity. For 40 years, the American line had been higher than any threat. On Tuesday afternoon in the Philippine Sea, those lines had crossed. The Secretary of Defense looked at the graph. He did not speak. An admiral stood at the lectern. "The data is conclusive, sir. The Aegis system performed exactly as programmed. It destroyed 72 units in less than 2 minutes. But the swarm was designed to exceed the physical storage of our ammunition. We ran out of lead before they ran out of drones. If the override signal had not been sent from the mainland, the Stennis would be at the bottom of the Philippine Sea." The secretary finally looked up. "So, the carrier is obsolete." The admiral shook his head. "No, sir. The carrier is a mobile airfield. It remains the most powerful tool for power projection on the planet. But the sanctuary of the carrier strike group is gone. We can no longer assume that a single ship, or even a group of destroyers, can create an impenetrable bubble. The math of oversaturation has caught up to the technology of defense." 3:45 in the afternoon. Beijing. The Ministry of National Defense. The Chinese commander who had directed the swarm was not being celebrated. He was sitting in a quiet office, reviewing the same data. On his screen, the focus was not on the drones that survived, but on the 72 that were destroyed. He spoke to his chief analyst. The Americans adjusted their firing cycles in 3 seconds. Their electronic warfare transition to emission control was faster than our simulations predicted. They are professional, they are disciplined, and now they are warned. The analyst nodded. They will change their software. They will increase their magazine depth. They might even deploy laser-based defense systems within the year. The commander looked out the window at the city skyline. Perhaps. But for 3 minutes, we held the most powerful machine in history in the palm of our hand. We proved that the ocean is no longer a private American lake. That is a shift in reality that no software patch can fix. 6 o'clock in the evening. The Philippine Sea. The USS John C. Stennis was still on station. The flight deck was busy. The roar of jet engines filled the air as F-18 Hornets were launched into the twilight. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. The ship looked as dominant and invincible as ever. But inside the ready rooms, the pilots were studying new tactical briefs. They were learning about swarm logic and kinetic saturation. They were being told that their primary mission was no longer just attacking the enemy, but protecting the very deck they landed on. Captain Miller stood on the bridge wing, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The orange light reflected off the gray steel of his ship. He thought about the lead drone. He thought about how close the black camera lens had come to his face. He realized that the gap between a routine patrol and a global catastrophe was now measured in inches and milliseconds. The crisis had resolved without a single human casualty. No missiles were launched from the silos. No ships were lost. But history had shifted. The world had moved from an era of undisputed naval supremacy to an era of calculated vulnerability. In the hallways of the Pentagon and the corridors of Zhanjiang, the analysts would spend years debating what had happened. They would call it a demonstration. They would call it a proof of concept. They would call it a warning. But for the sailors on the Stennis, the lesson was simpler. They had looked into the eyes of a new kind of war. It was a war of cold numbers and heartless geometry. And they knew that next time, the person holding the leash might not choose to pull back. Modern warfare is decided not by who fires first, but by who chooses not to fire at all. On a clear Tuesday afternoon, both sides had looked at the math and chosen restraint. It was the most professional act of the entire engagement. The ocean was dark now. The carrier moved forward into the night. It was still the king of the sea, but the crown felt a little heavier than it had before.